Previously on The Psychology of Entrepreneurship.
When I was about 17, it was my first stint on prison. And I was like a nervous wreck. Like, this is prison, and I'm here. Like, I'm still kind of trying to fathom what the next months and years will be like for me. And I was just all over the place. Especially for someone who is entering into the prison system for the first time, it is the scariest feeling in the world. Because I honestly didn't know if I would make it. Like, I thought that I was like entering into the last days of my life. I am a work in progress. I really am. Some days I wake up and, man, it's still a struggle. It's still a struggle to get to that point where I am okay.
It's nefarious, man. Like, the brain works in fucked up ways.
The mind is one of the most deceiving, manipulative pieces of equipment, flesh, human bodies on earth. I never have trusted my brain.
All of that weight lives in your head, and you are the decision maker.
Psychology of Entrepreneurship.
Hi, it's Ronsley. If this is your first volume, welcome. This is a weekly series where I go inside the mind of an entrepreneur, artist, athlete, academic to decipher what is the psychology of our decisions. I'm Australian, and I'd like to acknowledge our traditional custodians of country where I live and work. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge our continuous connection and contribution to land, sea, and community. You know, we are well into 2021, and one of the things that is taking up a lot of my time is Clubhouse. If you are on there, connect with me. I have never been more social than I have been in the last couple of weeks. My handle is @Ronsley, and we have a club on there too. It's called The Psychology of Entrepreneurship, and there are a few members. We have a bunch of followers that are joining all the time, which is insane. So join us on Clubhouse, or rather join me, and there are events on every day. So, you know, I'm having some insane conversations on there, and just like this show, the conversations are blowing my mind. And you know what? These are conversations I would have never had the chance to have if not for Clubhouse, the platform. Well, speaking of conversations that are super crazy, if you haven't listened to volumes 61 through 63, then, well, what? Why? Well, was it something I said? Well, you know, the reason I ask is none of those conversations would have happened if not for...
I'm Tessie Castillo. I'm a journalist and co-author of Crimson Letters, Voices from Death Row. And I would introduce myself to someone in prison. We prefer to use the word prisoner or resident rather than inmate. I would introduce them like I would introduce myself to anyone else. You know, it's just another person.
Okay, so you're a journalist, Tessie, and you talk to people that are about to be killed. And, you know, before I let Tessie answer that and tell us how she got involved in all this, I have to say that I can't imagine how the activist insider gives so much to strangers that she met in prison. And if I'm really honest, and in all honesty, I wish that we were all like that to, you know, our family members and the people that we meet every day. Just treat them like we would treat anyone else. But sorry, I digress.
In 2014, I had this extraordinary opportunity to teach a writing class to people on death row. And I walked in and I remember being really scared the first time and sort of unsure what I was doing in a room of about 20 men who'd all been convicted of murder. But I wanted to teach them how to write about their pasts, how they got to prison, what kind of growth they had gone through since they had been there. And as I started working with the guys and listening to their writing and helping them with their writing, I was just so captivated at the amount of growth that they had done and the amount of self-reflection that they had done since they had been in prison. I hadn't really expected that. There's a lot of wisdom and insight. So I wrote a letter to the local newspaper, an editorial, and I published it, basically talking about the humanity of people I had witnessed on death row. And about a week after I published that letter, I received a very terse response from the warden of the prison telling me that my services were no longer required, and they canceled my class.
You know, we are blessed to be talking with these amazing humans because, well, you know, they have to watch what they say because, well, 21 Jump Street.
I was forced to drop the charges because you forgot to read him his Miranda rights. What possible reason is there for not doing the only thing you have to do when arresting someone?
I did read him his right. I did a version of that.
Do you even know the Miranda rights?
Yes.
Let's hear them then.
You got a lot of stuff to do.
No, go ahead. You going anywhere, Schmidt? We got time.
I had a thing, but I could probably push it back.
Go ahead. It's 4 declamatory sentences followed by a question for a total of 57 words.
Okay. It obviously starts with you have the right to remain silent. I know you've heard this before. And then I think it sounds something like, well, the thing, you have the right to remain an attorney.
Did you say that you have the right to be an attorney?
You do have the right.
The Miranda rights are phrases we all recognize, well, anyone who watches movies anyway. They are better explained here.
Speak up to invoke your right to remain silent. What are the Miranda warnings? In 1966, in the case of Miranda versus Arizona, the Supreme Court held that the police must advise a suspect in custody of his constitutional rights before questioning that suspect. These rights, secured by the 5th and 6th Amendments to the Constitution, are: you have the right to remain silent. Any statement you make can and will be used as evidence against you in court. You have the right to consult with a lawyer and to have the lawyer present during the interrogation. If you cannot afford a lawyer may be appointed to represent you at no cost to you.
Be careful of what you say because the things you say can be used against you. Now, since putting this volume together, it has been brought to my attention that the Miranda rights only apply to police questioning and interrogation 14 days after an arrest. But there is such a thing as self-incrimination, and it happens more often than you think. So, Tessie, what they say to me, can it be used against them?
I mean, they have to be really careful. Every single one of these guys has a case that's still under review. So, especially when they're talking about their crimes and their cases, there's a lot that they need to be careful of. So if they get a gotcha question that they answer wrong could literally affect their lives. Because if prosecutors who are trying to get them executed get a hold of that information and use it against them in trial, when they go back to trial, most of them will. It could have huge repercussions.
Well, we here on the show take this as a privilege to cover these stories and have these conversations. And while I have been reviewing some cases through the last few months with us doing the story around the death penalty, well, there were a lot of really weird occurrences that didn't line up, like some people getting the death penalty that didn't actually kill anyone.
It's not uncommon to execute people who participated in a murder but didn't actually kill anyone. When I was teaching my class at Central Prison, there were 2 people who had been involved in some kind of a robbery that had ended in a murder. And in both cases, they got the death penalty as the accomplices, while the actual shooter, the one who did the killing, did not get the death penalty. And that is actually pretty common that happens. It's bizarre, but it does happen a lot here. It just goes to show how much the attorney that you have matters and how arbitrary the death penalty is. So if you've got somebody with a good attorney who was the shooter and somebody with a bad attorney who was the accomplice, then you're going to wind up with a situation like that. It can do with race. If the person who was the shooter was a different race, a white person maybe, you can wind up with that kind of an outcome. And there are lots of other reasons. If the attorney argues mental health for the shooter, if sometimes if one person is given the death penalty, the lawyer for the co-defendant can ask to move the trial to another county. And if you have a different jury, then they'll not give the death penalty. There's just a lot of weird things that go into it.
In a statement for the 2017 World Day Against the Death Penalty, United Nations human rights experts commented that people living in poverty are disproportionately affected by the death penalty for many reasons. They're an easy target for the police, they cannot afford a lawyer, the free legal assistance they might receive is of low quality, procuring expert evidence is beyond their means, tracing witnesses is too costly, and access to appeals often depends on being able to afford extra counsel. Many cannot afford bail and therefore remain in custody before their trials, further hindering their efforts to prepare an effective defense.
You know, we started covering the premeditated, state-sanctioned murders, which is really what the death penalty is. Well, we started covering them because, well, you know, Tessie says it best, really.
Just in the past few months, the United States has started executing federal prisoners on death row. That's something that we haven't done in this country for 17 years, whether under a Republican or a Democratic president. They just don't execute people at the federal level. But now, people who are being executed at the federal level would have been involved in crimes that involve murder and rape also. But then state level crimes, each state decides whether or not to have a death penalty, and some have and some don't. So within states, their decision to go after the death penalty varies widely, from no death penalty ever to a state like Texas, where they pride themselves on how many people they execute. But at the federal level, generally it's very quiet, and there's not a lot of people who get federal death sentences, and they're not typically executed. We haven't seen an execution in 17 years. But suddenly, in the past few months, President Trump, even now that he's leaving office, has spearheaded a rash of federal executions, several a month, which is something that hasn't been seen in this country in the past 130 years, not at that rate. There's someone executed today, there's going to be someone executed tomorrow. It's just execution after execution after execution. And within communities of people who are very affected by the death penalty and the criminal justice system and advocating against the death penalty, it's like living in the twilight zone. But people are rallying now, because for a long time, as support for the death penalty peters out and the death penalty is struck from the books in many states, it can be hard to get people interested and involved in anti-death penalty advocacy because there's not a sense of immediacy. But now that so many people are being killed in our names, you're seeing these huge influx of interest in this issue, and advocates who are having major conferences and get-togethers around what can we do to stop these executions. So one of those is going on this week, and Terry Robinson and I will be speaking at it on Saturday.
If you haven't met Terry, he is our guest from the previous volume. You can find the back catalog at psychologyofunentrepreneurship.com. So, Tessie, what needs to change? How does change even happen?
The political change happens when activists try really hard to petition for it. So there were years and years and years of activists who were pressuring the prison to install phones. People within the prison were pressuring the prison to install phones. And finally they did. Prisons are governed by a warden, and the wardens turn over pretty quickly. I've only ever seen a warden last a few years, couple years usually. And each one can have a different policy. They can change everything. So you'll see a warden who will open up the prison and let volunteers like me come in and give classes. And then the very next warden will take all the classes away, which is exactly what happened. They've gone through at least 3 wardens since the one that I knew, and they've had the classes and then they've had them taken away, and then the new one brought in the phones, and it's just kind of a mess.
In volume 62, we went deep into the topic of perspective. Everything changes with a change of perspective. And our guest that evening was...
My name is Arlene. I'm on death row. I've been in prison for a little over 27 and a half years. I've been on death row since 1997, November 21st, to be exact. I'm a co-author of the book Crimson Letters, Voices from Death Row, with Tessie, Castillo, and 3 other death row inmates. We wrote the book a couple of years ago and, finally got it published. And I'm also a MC with music that I'm releasing live on Death Row. Some projects I'm working on as well.
I wanted you to hear Alim's voice because I asked Tessie whether she remembered meeting him for the first time.
Alim had been in that first class, and I remember him probably more than anyone. He's a very big man. He's one of those people who just has a presence. As soon as he walks into the room, he has kind of a booming voice that I would consider a good radio voice. And everybody always felt they deferred to him in many ways. He was clearly a leader in the group, and people listened to his opinion and they respected him. So I really was drawn to him for that reason. And he was also a great writer. So after my class was canceled, I wrote to him and I said that I wanted to continue to stay in touch and that I was really impressed with his writing and I wanted to help him work on it and maybe help him get published someday.
When we come back, you get to meet some questions that we've all had since we started listening to this volume. The one that annoys you more than anything, that question. Well, more on that after the messages.
Our aim with this audio documentary has always been to build a strong community of entrepreneurs and creatives to provide a space where they can use their voice to share their authenticity with the world. As a valued listener, your voice matters too. We love to hear your feedback and ideas, so don't be shy to let us know how we're doing in the ratings and comments. If you have a message for our production team or know someone who would be a perfect fit as a guest, you can find out more information on how to share your input at psychologyoфentrepreneurship.com.
Hey, welcome back. So, Tessie, what I want to know is how safe is it for someone like you to be constantly exposed to people on death row? Like, who are these people? Like, what are they like? What have they done?
So people on death row in North Carolina have all been convicted of murder. And there are many, many people convicted of every year, and only a few of them actually go to death row. And before getting involved in this kind of work, I thought that the people who go to death row, who are people who have received death sentences, so they're going to be executed by the state. I thought that they were the worst of the worst, that they had committed the most horrific of the murders. But one thing that I found that really shocked me is that that's not true, that it's actually fairly arbitrary who goes to death row and who doesn't. So you do receive an execution date at the time that you're sentenced. However, you're able to appeal the conviction, and appeals take decades. 10 years, 20 years. Alim has been on death row 27 years. He's still appealing his conviction. So until those appeals end, you can't schedule an execution.
There are 2 things that are very, very important, and I want to cover them one at a time. The first thing is about things going wrong. Well, more specifically, it's about the times when executions don't go according to plan.
They can get pretty ugly. Oftentimes the injections don't really work because there's no cocktail of drugs that is made specifically to kill someone. There's no company that will make that drug. So what states do is they create their own cocktails. They sort of mix up different drugs. And often there's litigation over that. So currently in North Carolina, they haven't executed anyone for over a decade because there's litigation in the courts over that cocktail. The companies that make the different ingredients are fighting it. They don't like for their medicine to be used to kill people. So it's always really messy how the drugs are used, what drugs are used. And so it often goes wrong. And so you'll see something not working and you'll see people gasping and having seizures.
The second most important subject of killing people is, well, what if the person is innocent? Would you want to be responsible for ordering the execution of an innocent person?
There's a lot of innocent people on death row. And I'm learning more and more about how that happens. It's really incredible. I mean, there's so many cases where you have a prosecutor who can just play really fast and loose with the facts of the case, who can present some information but not others to make a situation look like it happened a certain way. And then if you've got a defense attorney who's not on their game, then that's how it happens. And we have defense attorneys sometimes who are paid so little and given so many cases to represent that they can't do a very good job of defending someone. And it happens all the time. Like in Terry's case, his defense attorneys did not present a defense at all during his trial.
And speaking about innocent people, in volume 63, we spoke with a gentleman by the name of Terry Robinson, who we spoke about earlier in this volume.
I am currently fighting a wrongful conviction. And it's not something that I say lightly, because I understand the stigma in institutions behind claims of innocence. But that doesn't take away from the fact that throughout my life, I have engaged in a lot of poor choices and a lot of ill behavior. I was a criminal. I did sell drugs. At 17 years old, the charge that I was locked up for was snatching a woman's pocketbook. Like, I had learned from this older guy, like, this is the quick way to make money. And I was so naive. I was so, I guess, infatuated and influenced by this person that I tried my hand. And it certainly did work for me. And I'm glad, because that was like the end of my pocketbook snatching days. But looking back over my life, I am accountable for a lot of things that I wish I could take back now. But I chalk a lot of it up to the human error and the human circumstance. I mean, we are human. We are prone to error. And unfortunately, a lot of times that includes criminal behavior.
Tessie, what were your first memories of Terry?
He was in my class at Central Prison when I taught a journaling class to guys on death row. He's actually the first person that I described in the book, Crimson Letters, because I remember him so well. He was such a sweet person. He was very encouraging. He would always compliment the other guys in the class on their writing. He was very soft-spoken. He just had this presence that was peaceful and kind. And I liked having him in my class.
This is a bit of a long fact, but it's really interesting, so bear with me. In an article published by the Equal Justice Initiative, they state that more than 170 people have been exonerated and released from death row since 1973. There are many reasons why someone might be wrongfully convicted, including incorrect eyewitness identifications, false and coerced confessions, inadequate legal defense, false or misleading forensic evidence, or false accusations or perjury by witnesses who are promised lenient treatment or other incentives in exchange for their testimony. Misconduct by police or prosecutors, or both, was involved in 79% of homicide exonerations in 2018. Concealing evidence that casts doubt on the defendant's guilt is the most common type of misconduct, which includes police officers threatening witnesses, forensic analysts faking results, or prosecutors presenting false testimony. A record 111 exonerations in 2018 involve witnesses who lied on the stand or falsely accused a defendant. In 50 of these cases, the defendant was falsely accused of a crime that never happened.
I want to know if Tessie had witnessed an execution and what happens when we are about to kill somebody. By the way, I say that on purpose because if you think that you don't have a part to play or I don't have a part to play, well, the state or the world or the country is executing people in our name, I suppose.
The executions happen inside the prison. There's a special room for them. And typically, a prisoner will receive a letter about 90 days or 45 days prior to, which will tell them the date and the time of the execution. At that point, they will receive one phone call prior to the execution from the governor. And the phone call is a potential clemency phone call. So they'll hear literally hours before the execution takes place whether or not the governor is going to grant them a pardon and take them off of death row. The current governor that we have has never granted anyone clemency. So the likelihood that you would get that is very, very slim. But still, we don't give them that information until the 11th hour. So there's always this sort of wondering what's going to happen. About 72 hours before the execution takes place, the prisoner is led out of their cell and put in a special cell. Their head is shaved, I believe, and they have their last meal and their last rites with any spiritual person who they might be involved with, Alim is a Muslim. And they're able to have a visit with family and with their lawyers, their last visits. And then they go into the execution room. We do lethal injection here in North Carolina. They're strapped to a gurney that looks like a cross. And it's in a room with a window, and people are watching. So the people can be their family members of the victim, journalists, lawyers can watch. And so they're able to say their last words in front of the audience. And then they're killed by lethal injection. So there's a doctor who injects something into their veins. First, that causes paralysis, so that if they feel pain or agony, you can't see it because they're paralyzed. They can't show it. And then the other injection is what kills them.
I'm sorry you had to hear that, but as we promised you, these are difficult conversations that we need to have. Like in a previous volume, volume 61, we covered purpose. I find it insanely humbling to think that someone can find purpose while being on death row. I guess that volume spoke a lot of amazing things, including...
I think I really advanced my understanding of not just social psychology, but and this, I think, talks directly to your podcast. Its relation to economics and trends when I began reading Malcolm Gladwell. I'm a big fan of his work, and when I read the book Tipping Point, it really began me to look at large-scale social psychological phenomena and how they influence our thinking through trends.
So, of course, if you haven't listened to that one, go download it and cue it for later listening. But that gentleman you heard, his name is Lyle May. While I was talking with Tessie, she recalls this quote that he has, but I asked her if she remembered that story at all.
I don't remember during class what he would say, but there are a couple of quotes from his letters, but his early ones that he wrote to me years ago that still stick with me because they were so powerful. And one of them I remember him saying is, he said, I can't quote him exactly, but as I go through life, seeing things and learning about things that I can no longer taste or touch or feel, I beg God for mercy, and I plead with him to give my time here purpose beyond punishment. And that was actually, that phrase, purpose beyond punishment, was a title that I considered for the book. Because I just thought that that phrase so embodies these men, and what I know about them is their relentless pursuit of finding a purpose in their life, a purpose in being on death row that goes beyond the punishment. They all do it, all four of them, and they do it successfully, and it's so impressive to those of us on the outside. Just very inspiring to remind us to also find our purpose and not let anything get in the way.
And Tessie, do you remember meeting Lyle for the first time?
I met Lyle in the journaling class. I remember him because he was very quiet, but he was really, really smart. He was one of those people who rarely spoke, but when he did speak, the whole room was quiet because everyone was listening to him. And what's always impressed me about him since then is this is a guy who's been on death row since he was 19 years old. He's never handled a computer before. He's never been on the internet. He's never handled a smartphone. And yet he manages to network from inside the prison, even before they had access to phones. And he would know people in the government, and he goes out and gets his own interviews independently of me. He is connected at Columbia University and Yale, and he's pursuing all these degrees. He has a higher degree than I do, I think, higher education, all this from within the prison. And I'm just like, okay, dude, no excuse.
Yes, no excuses. I know that these volumes and these topics would have opened your mind up a little. And if you like to get involved, well, Tessie, how can they get involved?
We have a book club that we do, and we do it for 5 weeks. And each week, one of the guys calls in. And so everybody gets to ask questions. And we've had people from Australia participate in the book club too.
The links and how to get in touch with Tessie to get involved in the book club will be in the show notes at psychologyoфentrepreneurship.com. So go check that out.
Psychology of
Entrepreneurship. Coming up on the Psychology of Entrepreneurship.
I think no one should ever be forced into entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is something when you have a true desire to solve a problem that you obsess about. If you want to do a small good in the world, you start a nonprofit. If you want to do a large good in the world, you start for profit. And here's why. Because profit is the engine that allows you to scale. Those are the people who sit in an audience when Kobe is hitting the 3 after 3, right? Those are the people who always told everyone you can't do it. And when they do it, they are the ones who are watching on the sideline saying, I always knew you would do it.
Psychology of Entrepreneurship.
I interviewed Tessie because Tessie Castillo is an author, journalist, and public speaker who specializes in stories on criminal justice, drug policy, prison reform, and racial equity. She co-wrote her first book, Crimson Letters, Voices from Death Row, with 4 men serving death sentences in North Carolina, whom, by the way, she met while volunteering in North Carolina's Central Prison back in 2014. While volunteering, Castillo was moved by the wisdom, humility, and accountability of the men in prison, and then she wrote an editorial in 2014 May to the Raleigh News and Observer, advocating for the humanity of people on death row. Crimson Letters illuminates the complex stew of choice and circumstance that brought 4 men on death row and their search for hope and purpose behind bars. Since its publication, Castillo and her co-authors, who all call in from prison, have been speaking on criminal justice issues and sharing their story with universities, faith groups, nonprofits, radio shows, podcasts like myself, and some pretty big ones around the planet. They host a free book club, which you can find in the show notes and the link to that. She is an amazing human being. I love her humanity, and she's a dear friend.
Psychology of Entrepreneurship.
This is a Must Amplify production. Special thanks to every guest expert that has appeared on the show. Editing, voiceovers, and sound design by Kaylee Bonnyman and Tiago Vega. Guest research by Jenna Elliott. Content by Corinne Castles. Project managed by the legend that is Kaylee Bonnyman. Produced and hosted by me, Ronsley Vaz. For more episodes and way to listen, go to mustamplify.com/POE.
Love the polished audio docuseries style of this podcast, The Psychology of Entrepreneurship? At We Are Podcast, you can learn how to create a similar style for your own show. This revolutionary virtual event assembles podcasters, entrepreneurs, and marketers in one spot, so you're able to learn from the masters. Head straight to wearepodcast.com to reserve your spot at our next event.